you imagine a people who fought not to live, but to die? What if death, not survival, was their ultimate goal? What if war itself was just a road to death, not life? Have you ever heard of warriors who fought only to secure their own death? The Vikings believed dying in battle was not defeat, it was the greatest triumph. The mythology of the Norse world, preserved in the poetic Edda, the prose Edda of Snorri Sturluson, and the sagas compiled in Iceland between the 9th and 13th centuries, presents a pantheon where war, honor, and fate are inseparably bound together. The Norse, whose Viking age extended roughly from 793 CE to 1066 CE, lived in a world defined by seafaring, raids, and battles across Europe, from the coasts of England and Ireland to the rivers of Russia and the Mediterranean. Their gods reflected this harsh environment, and none were more significant in the shaping of their worldview than Odin, Thor, and Tyr, the gods of war and guardians of order in a cosmos threatened by chaos. Unlike the war deities of Egypt, Greece, or Rome, the Norse gods were not distant embodiments of abstract ideals. They were woven into the everyday lives of Viking warriors, their sagas sung in longhouses, their names invoked before raids, their symbols carved into runestones and weapons. War in Norse society was not merely conflict, but a sacred duty, tied to destiny, honor, and the eternal struggle that would culminate in Ragnarok, the end of the world foretold in myth. Odin, often described as the All-Father, occupied the highest seat in Asgard, yet his association with war was distinct from mere bloodshed. Odin was a god of wisdom, poetry, sorcery, and kingship, but he was also the chooser of the slain. According to the Eddaic poems, Odin selected which warriors would fall in battle, guiding the Valkyries who carried the chosen dead to Valhalla, the great hall of the slain. There, these warriors, the Einherjar, trained daily, preparing for the ultimate battle at Ragnarok. The cult of Odin is evidenced archaeologically in Viking Age burials and place names across Scandinavia, as well as in accounts from contemporaries such as Adam of Bremen, who in the 11th century described sacrifices to Odin at the great temple of Uppsala in Sweden. Unlike Mars of Rome or Ares of Greece, Odin did not represent discipline on the battlefield, but rather the deeper, more unsettling reality of fate in war, that no victory came without loss, and that the fallen served a purpose in the divine order. He was worshipped as the god who could grant victory, but also as the one who demanded sacrifice, sometimes in the form of humans hanged or speared in rituals meant to mirror Odin's own self-sacrifice on Yggdrasil, the world tree, where he hung for 9 nights to gain the wisdom of runes. Thor, the thunder god, offered a different kind of warlike protection. Unlike Odin's complex and often grim associations, Thor was the defender of both gods and humans, protector of Midgard, and enemy of the giants who embodied chaos. Armed with his hammer Mjölnir, Thor symbolized direct strength, courage, and the physical power needed to repel enemies. Archaeological evidence shows that Mjölnir amulets were worn widely across Viking society, discovered in graves from Denmark to Russia, often as pendants intended to invoke Thor's protection. In myth, Thor's battles against the giants, such as his duel with Hrungnir or his fishing expedition, where he nearly caught the world serpent Jormungand, represented not only cosmic conflicts, but also the everyday struggle of Norse farmers and warriors against the forces of nature and fate. In contrast to Odin, whose worship was often tied to kings, chieftains, and poets, Thor was the god of the common man, invoked in oaths, legal matters, and daily survival. He was especially revered during the Viking Age, when Norsemen set sail across Europe, and his hammer was used in ceremonies to bless marriages and consecrate land, as recorded in 10th and 11th century sources. Tyr, though less prominent in later Norse religion, was one of the oldest war gods in the Germanic pantheon, his name cognate with deus, the Proto-Indo-European word for god. Tyr's role was not in brute strength or mystical wisdom, but in justice, law, and the binding power of oaths. The most famous myth concerning Tyr is his sacrifice in binding the wolf Fenrir, when the gods attempted to restrain Fenrir with a magical chain. The beast demanded that one of them place a hand in its mouth as a pledge of honesty. Tyr, knowing the chain would never be broken, volunteered and lost his right hand when Fenrir realized the trick. This act enshrined Tyr as the god of courage and honor, willing to sacrifice himself to protect the order of the cosmos. Roman historian Tacitus, writing in the 1st century CE in his work Germania, described the Germanic peoples worshipping a war god he equated with Mars, likely referring to Tyr. Although by the Viking Age Odin and Thor overshadowed Tyr, inscriptions and runestones still attest to his importance in earlier centuries. His legacy endured in the naming of Tuesday, Tiw's Day in Old English, Tyr's Day in Old Norse, embedding him into the calendar of later European societies. The historical context of Norse warfare reveals how these gods shaped the mindset of the Viking Age, beginning with the raid on Lindisfarne in 793 CE. Viking expeditions brought Norse warriors into contact with Christian Europe, where chroniclers often describe them as savage pagans guided by warlike gods. Yet archaeology and sagas show a more nuanced picture. Raids were accompanied by rituals, sacrifices, and invocations of Odin, Thor, and Tyr. Warriors sought Odin's favor to secure entry into Valhalla, Thor's blessing to protect their voyages and settlements, and Tyr's justice to bind oaths of loyalty within their war bands. The ethos of these deities was reflected in the very structure of Viking society, where honor and reputation were paramount. To die bravely in battle was not defeat, but the highest form of triumph, a passage to immortality in the halls of Odin. The influence of these war gods extended beyond the battlefield into law, culture, and daily life. Thor's hammer was used in legal assemblies called things, where disputes were settled under divine witness. Odin's runes, according to myth, granted knowledge of fate and were inscribed on weapons and charms. Tyr's association with law and oaths meant that treaties and alliances carried sacred weight. Even burial practices reflected these beliefs. Grave goods often included weapons, amulets, and offerings intended to equip the dead for their journey to Valhalla or to other realms of the afterlife. The archaeological record, from ship burials like that of Osberg in Norway, 834 CE, to warrior graves across Sweden and Denmark, demonstrates the integration of religious and martial ideals. The climax of Norse mythology, Ragnarok, further underscores the role of these gods in defining war as a cosmic principle. The myths foretell that Odin will lead the Einherjar in the final battle against the giants, only to fall to Fenrir. Thor will slay Jormungandr, but succumb to its poison. Tyr will face Garm, the Hound of Hell, and both will perish. The inevitability of their deaths reflects a worldview where even gods are bound by fate, and that courage is defined not by victory, but by standing against inevitable doom. This mythic vision mirrored the realities of Viking life, where seafaring voyages were perilous and death was ever present. It offered meaning to struggle, framing war not as chaos, but as part of a larger order in which courage, loyalty, and sacrifice were paramount. By the late Viking Age, as Christianity spread across Scandinavia in the 10th and 11th centuries, the cults of Odin, Thor, and Tyr began to wane, though resistance was fierce. Thor, in particular, remained a popular figure among common people, his hammer amulets continuing to be worn even in Christianized contexts as a silent protest or as symbols reinterpreted to resemble the cross. Written sources, such as the Icelandic sagas, recorded between the 12th and 13th centuries, preserved the memory of these gods even as the old religion gave way. The endurance of their myths demonstrates how deeply the Norse conception of war, honor, and fate was tied to these deities. The legacy of Odin, Thor, and Tyr is not confined to the Viking Age. Their myths shaped medieval perceptions of the North, influenced later Germanic epics such as the Nibelungenlied, and were revived in the 19th century during the Romantic fascination with Norse heritage. Today, their stories continue to inspire literature, art, and even modern popular culture. Yet at their core, these figures remain testaments to a society that viewed war not merely as conquest, but as an eternal struggle bound to cosmic law. Odin, with his grim wisdom and claim over the slain, embodied the inevitability of fate. Thor, with his hammer and thunder, represented the defense of order against chaos. Tyr, with his sacrifice, symbolized justice and honor. Together, they defined the Norse vision of war as both sacred and tragic, a path to glory and destruction alike, and an inseparable part of the human condition.